About 1 minute. Oh,
All right, we're live. Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. This is a chance for you to speak with Brandon and Caitlin. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach with Effective Artistry, and I'm joined by Brandon Tessers and Caitlin Miller, both therapists with Effective Artistry. And this is like open office hours, an open on conversation with Brandon and Caitlin, and a chance for you to ask questions about all things neurodiversity and mental health. Anything else that's on your mind? We like to have a topic if we can in advance. I have a couple of questions that I'll put to you both today that we've been asked. But if you're joining us in the chat and you've got questions, please pop them in the chat and I'll ask them on your behalf. A little bit about Effective Artistry. It's a neurodiversity affirming therapy practice based in Northbrook, Illinois. So all the therapists at the practice are licensed to work with anyone in the state of Illinois. And there's also a couple of coaches, myself and Sarah, who can work with you wherever you are in the world. And I think that's our introductions. So hello. I wanted to get to the hello bit. Hello.
Hello.
good to see you, Marie. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. A little bit tired today, but I'm okay. Glad to be here. How are you both doing?
Good. It's beautiful.
Good, yeah. Happy to be here. Looking at birds out the window, eating berries out of this tree outside of the window.
It was fun
nice.
to watch my last session.
Yeah.
As well as my client. Not just the bird.
There was a time, I think 2 years ago, maybe 2020, like early days of the pandemic, where there was one particular client that I had offered to meet outdoors in the summer.
Ooh.
And so we were meeting in like a park under like a pavilion. It was an open air thing, so we could see everybody. There was no one around us, whatever. But it was so hot, and at one point, a squirrel came into the pavilion and did this thing that squirrels do apparently when it gets too hot, like on the cool concrete that was in the shade. It flattened out, like extended its limbs in all directions.
God.
And the client and I were both like looking at this squirrel and talking about this squirrel for a while. And it wasn't until later, this client has ADHD, I have ADHD, we were talking about ADHD related issues. It wasn't until later that I realized how stereotypical the two of us both been, of like, we're talking about a squirrel. There's a squirrel.
Wow, that's a good joke. Wow. It happened in 3D.
Yeah.
They call it splooting, I think, when a squirrel does that or an animal does that. A sploot. I think that's quite cute.
Luke.
It sounds like half cute, half gross.
Yeah.
Go either way. Anyway, glad to be here.
Nice though that you can get out and therapize in the fresh air and hang out with your clients outside.
Yeah, Brandon made a very good choice of office location. It's very pretty.
Yeah, it was very specific and deliberate. But yeah, during those early days, we were finding ways to make things work when it was not everybody was able to or comfortable with switching to online work.
Yeah.
So
Oh, that was such a big deal.
I didn't even have an office space for the first, I don't even know. Like, I think we got this office in June of 2021. So until that point, from like February or March of 2020, I wasn't seeing anybody. Haven't figured out if we're going to let me stream at the office yet, so I can't stay, but I hope you have a good stream. So thank you.
That's
Thanks for
so
stopping
sweet.
by. Hope everything
Hello,
goes
Dr. Snyder.
like a new job, so congrats and good luck.
Yeah, good luck.
Anyway, we have some questions today, you said, Marie?
We have a couple of questions. So just before we started, I read one of them out to Caitlin. So they're very different. One is actually from a coach, and one is from an autistic person who says, how about, why can I help everyone else with every conceivable problem with perfect suggestions and wisdom, yet fail to help myself? And in brackets, Obviously, I'm asking for a friend or someone I met once.
Oh,
funny.
that's cute. I like the joke.
Yeah. That's a good question, and we can talk some about that. Do you want to tell me the other question too, and we'll just
Yeah. So
see
the
what we
other
can do.
question came in on Mastodon. I think there's a bit of an echo. Is there at my end?
I'm not hearing an echo
I
here.
think I heard a really tiny one.
If anyone in the chat is hearing an echo, let us know.
So this one is a question from a coach about workplace accommodations. I'm a life coach and neurodivergent. When a client identifies as ADHD, either self-identified or diagnosed, I'm never sure how to help them investigate accommodations at work. It feels risky to me. Where can they start without laying landmines they may later step on? And they go on to say that their clients are in the US, Canada, and also international. So the laws and the norms differ. So it might be quite a complex question to answer.
Yeah, and I like both these questions, and both of them, of course, there's a lot of complexity and nuance and specifics that would vary from one case to the next, but there are, I think, helpful things to say in both cases.
Where shall we begin, Brendan?
Which one jumped out at you? We're going to do both. Help me make sure that we manage the time so we can do both.
I feel like the workplace accommodations is more of a tangible thing that we can start with. I don't know.
Okay. Workplace accommodations is, I think we've talked about it in the past, so there might be like some VODs that people can look up of the stream on this subject.
Yeah.
But it's, even within the same country, it is not monolithic. It's different everywhere you go. But what I would say is, especially for this person who's coming from the perspective of a life coach trying to help their clients, is going to your employer and asking for an accommodation in those terms, like this is an accommodation that I need because I have ADHD or whatever.
Mhm.
It can be risky depending on your employer, and there's very little that we as individuals can do about that. You have the employer that you have, right? I mean, obviously, to the extent that I can say, if you don't feel safe and comfortable with your boss, supervisor, employer, whatever,
Mhm.
then to whatever extent you are able, I would say continue to look for some place where that might be the case, where you could feel safe and comfortable to talk with them.
Yeah.
But people have the options they have.
Mhm.
So that to me is a last resort. That going to an employer and saying, I need this accommodation because of X or Y is a last resort. There are a lot of other things we can try before we get to that point. And again, varies person to person. If you have a good relationship with your employer, whatever, then you can stick to that. But even then, it's not necessary to jump to that point. The very first thing is to explore what you can do that you don't need to ask anybody else's permission or assistance with.
Mhm.
So like a common example of this will be that people have fidgets or stims that don't work well in their professional environment. And so there are ways, especially in the role of a coach, to be able to help someone explore alternative or replacement fidgets and stims. That's something that I had to do before. The larger the organization that you work for, the more codified this process is and the less leeway and flexibility any individual has.
Yeah.
So what's a stim or a fidget that somebody might be benefited by but isn't
Rocking.
rocking? But that's a difficult one for social reasons.
My favorite, thinking putty, because it doesn't make any noise.
Yeah, in both of those cases, those aren't likely to be things that you would at any point request an accommodation for. Like you can rock at your workplace, it just might be socially.
Well, I was trying to think of an example that you'd have to adjust to them.
Well, you might, in this case, you wouldn't have to adjust it. There's no policy requiring that you don't do it.
Well, but if you were like a lawyer in a meeting with someone giving them legal advice and then your body was moving and they're trying to.
Yes. It absolutely can be a thing that people will look. I'll say stims and fidgets are something that everybody does.
Mhm.
We don't call it those things for most people. Stimming
Yeah.
gets used for autistic people, fidgeting gets used for ADHD people. In my terminology, everyone does some of each, and the two things are different.
Yeah.
They look similar, or like the activities are similar, but the purpose of them, the mechanism of what they're doing are different things. And everybody does them, but some are more socially acceptable than others, or at least different ones are perceived in different ways. As an example, this twirling hair, playing with hair, biting on hair is a stim or a fidget, depending on the context, that lots of people do without any kind of an official diagnosis. And it is generally, at least in the United States, looked at as a sign of nervousness or naivete or insecurity, right?
Mhm.
Whereas this, twirling my beard hairs,
I wonder who tends to have beards.
exactly, and who tends to have long hair.
You're so wise.
Oh, like Brandon. He has. He is the
This is
story.
also a stim or a fidget, and yes, it is perceived differently. If you think about some of the
I
most
am a
like
philosopher.
standard office toys things, like Newton's cradles,
Mhm.
Zen gardens, I forget what they're called, but when you can hold the balls that you move around in your hand,
Yeah.
that could be made to sound dirty, I suppose. I don't know what the actual name is.
The plastic spheres.
Sure. Stress balls.
Oh yeah.
Really, like people will take pieces of paper and just slowly rip it up and create confetti on their desk all day long. Pen twirling or tapping or drumming,
Yeah.
legs bouncing, feet tapping. But everybody does these things, and we could have a whole stream on just what fidgeting and stimming is and whatever. I just was pulling that out as an example. So if it's something like that where it's like you're worried about how people are perceiving you, there still is worth looking into some kind of replacement fidget or stim.
Mhm.
And I have a process that I would recommend for that if we have time to go there on like how to look for those things and experiment with them. Same if there's something that your workplace doesn't allow. So like a very common thing here is people who will listen to music or podcasts or just have noise canceling headphones or noise isolating headphones, and then working at a job where you're not allowed to have headphones in and are not allowed to play music at your desk.
Mhm.
That's the kind of thing where you could eventually theoretically ask for an accommodation to be allowed to wear noise isolating or noise canceling headphones.
Mhm.
So there are other things that you can look at there too. Um, so in either case, that's one of the common things, right? Is when there's some stim or fidget or some accommodation that works for you that is either frowned upon or you're worried about how you'd be perceived or it's not allowed, you can look at replacement things. And there are processes we can talk about there.
I'm curious, Brandon, a big thing that comes up for my clients is wanting to work from home more or wanting to work from home only, and then having extensions of deadlines.
Mm.
I feel like those are the two things that they talk about most wanting formal accommodations for. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Those two specific ones are tricky. In the first case, because what's called hybrid work or fully remote work are larger issues beyond individual people's operating, like ways of being and preferences and whatever.
What do you mean by that?
Depending on the workplace. So these are trends, right? Like individual workplaces are different. But obviously, early 2020, the start of the pandemic, a huge shift to full remote for as many people as were able to do it.
Yeah.
And then since then, more and more and more employers have gotten into pushes for back at the office mandates. Some were straight to like full back in, some are adapting to you're required to be in for a couple days a week or a certain amount of time, and et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm happy to talk about this for sure. It's something that I care a lot about. But unlikely to be, in most cases, a lot of flexibility. And that is the kind of thing where quite likely if your employer is not open to the idea of you working from home more or fully, that it's unlikely that presenting a diagnosis of any kind is going to change their standpoint on that, and could be viewed as trying to make an excuse in order to get away with something. In other words, here's what all the data shows. We have a lot of research about this, especially over the last few years, although the research cycle is long and not all, it takes a while to fully publish and that kind of thing. But all the research we have available shows that giving employees the choice to work remotely or work in a hybrid manner at their discretion increases all outcomes for everybody. Productivity increases, profits increase, employee happiness and therefore retention increases, so turnover decreases. Is better for everybody.
Yeah.
So the question then is, and this is larger than a neurodiversity issue, the question then is, why would anybody be pushing for mandated time in the office? Again, something I'd be happy to talk about, but it has a lot more to do with our views on productivity and how hierarchical management structures are set up. About.
So are you saying with the two people who would like to work remotely more often, that those two people, if they presented a diagnosis and asked for formal workplace accommodations, most likely the workplace would say no?
Well, so that's a case of, like I said, the first thing that I would help somebody explore are things that can be done on their own without needing to go to their employers at all.
Yeah.
Then there's only so much you can do there, right? Like working remotely, if you have a mandate, you have to involve talking to your supervisors or whatever. And so at that step, I would encourage people to go and talk to their employers without any discussion of it as an accommodation or any discussion of a diagnosis first. Just see what flexibility there is.
Yeah.
You don't know, I mean, each person knows their own supervisor to the extent that they do. But in this case, I would say talk to your employers about.
Yeah, they both did that, and they said no.
So at that point, I would say, depending on how stringent and difficult the thing is, you can. Okay, well, let's get into that. If you go to the route of making a formal request for accommodations, some organizations have official processes in place for doing this kind of thing. And the larger your organization is, the more likely that they have an official process in place. Overwhelmingly likely that if that's the case, you would go to someone in HR first, rather than talking to your direct supervisor first.
Yeah.
That's part of how there's some kind of built-in protection from retaliation, theoretically, that HR is the one who's talking with you. Theoretically, and people don't always do these things, obviously, but that's where I would start, is research. This is the same thing I tell people when they're asking about like emotional support animals or any kind of accommodation, is anything which isn't dictated by law is up to the individual policies of whatever organization. So there's no law about emotional support animals.
I thought there was the ADA though in the United States.
In the United States, there is the ADA. And what the ADA says is that organizations must provide reasonable accommodations for equitable access.
What would access mean?
So in the original conceptualization of the ADA, it literally means people being able to enter and operate within these spaces. So things like ramps are covered under the ADA. Well, not just physicality, like special ed is also covered under this, providing accommodations for a person to be able to engage with the academic environment on as much of an equal access to that information and process as possible. But the problem with the ADA is reasonable is a word that has a very specific usage in the United States legal code. And it's there for a reason, because the people who are writing the laws don't imagine that they could cover in specific detail every single specific circumstance. So they have to leave it open to the interpretation of the courts. The problem with the ADA is that it is reliant on the aggrieved party to initiate a suit. So essentially, if you ask for an accommodation that you believe is reasonable and should be covered by the ADA, and they say no, the only thing you can do is sue them, with your claim being that what you have requested is mandated because it would be covered by the ADA, and they're going to respond to that suit by saying, no, that's an unreasonable accommodation that you're asking for.
I feel like this is gonna sound kind of dark, but I feel like that can be a way to force an employer's hand, because I think a lot of employers don't like to go to court even if the person couldn't afford to go to court. But I also
but that's a very dangerous game to play with your employer.
I am concerned I am taking us off course. My intention behind bringing this up is I was thinking about things that would go so far that actually asking for an accommodation might be necessary, because I was perceiving you were answering the question starting off at like the mildest form of what can we do together to try to accommodate you without having to do anything necessarily with your employer.
Sure. And it's good to cover the whole gamut. And yes, when you go to your employer and say that you want an accommodation, like you're using that term, and or giving the justification of, because I have ADHD, because I am autistic, whatever, that's why I need the accommodation. Of course, again, people can respond however differently, but there's an implied threat to that. Yeah. At least it's likely that it will be interpreted with an implied threat. You're using legal language to invoke this idea that you have to give to me what I am asking you to give to me. And the unspoken, and if you don't, you're breaking the law. So just to finish off the suit thing, is every time someone goes through the process of suing over an ADA accommodation request, and the courts eventually end up finding that, yes, that's precedent now. So you don't always have to go initiate a lawsuit yourself. The other possibility is that you can find, or your lawyer, or with help, you can find precedent that's been set of like, see, employers are required, mandated to do this thing as proven in this other case. That way I don't have to sue you. I can just say, see, it's already been ruled on. This is a matter of settled law. But yes, threatening to sue your employer is not likely to go super well. And I am guessing, because when I've been asked these questions before, I'm guessing that what the person asking the question was referring to in terms of landmines wasn't about that part, but was more about, well, if I tell my boss that I have ADHD and therefore I can't X or whatever, then maybe they'll think of me as incompetent, or they'll pass me over for opportunities, or look down at me.
I think I was reading the landmines thing as more of the legal stuff, but that makes sense. I feel like a more typical landmine is would an example be like, will I get promoted to become a manager, or will I get this project I really want to get?
Right, if you tell your employer you're autistic, many people think of autistic people as being bad at social skills, and therefore would no longer consider you for a leadership position that you might be interested in. If you tell your employer you have ADHD, many people think of ADHD as, can't operate independently, can't set deadlines, and they might micromanage you even more. So what really, I mean, requesting accommodations at that point, and this plays into what we've been talking about these last few weeks about asking for what you want without feeling the need to justify it first. If then, like our conversation, if you want the lights to be dimmer, just go ask if you can have the lights be dimmer. If you're afraid to do that, unless you can justify it, then by the time you go make the request, you might, from your perspective, think that you're saying like, hey, I'm so sorry to ask for this thing. I wouldn't accept for blah, blah, blah. And they might interpret it that way, or they might interpret it as you're coming to tell them that they aren't supporting you, and that they aren't following the law, and that they aren't open.
Or they're like discriminatory or something.
Right. And they could, especially if they're thinking, well, you haven't told me anything about this. I don't know why you're coming at me out of nowhere, like providing all this documentation before just asking, it can feel very combative. So really, I would suggest communication first. Now, I don't know what position this person who asked the question is in, but I do a lot on my end to advocate with management, with leadership, to help teach them, show them how it is beneficial for them to be as open and accommodating as possible with as low of a bar for entry as possible. Because again, all the data we have shows that, surprise, surprise, when people are supported and respected and given some measure of autonomy, or their autonomy is respected, they do better,
Yeah.
just generally. So it's better for leadership, but you're not always in that position to be able to talk.
I really like that, Brandon, how the first ask is before you're dying of thirst and without any sort of reasoning, and just to see if it's possible. Because it could be in like month 3, the lights have bothered you and you ask for things to change, and then they just change instead of waiting until month 9 and you're like, I can't even go into the office until the lights get changed.
Yeah.
Now, if you do that initial ask of like, hey, can we have the lights dimmer? And they say no, right? And then you start to think, okay, I need some reasoning. At that point, I would say jump to the impact it has on you, not the intermediate step of why it impacts you in that way. Meaning, if you say, these lights give me headaches, or these lights make it very hard for me to focus on what I'm doing, or whatever, then that can be, oh, okay, that makes sense. We can adjust it to some extent, whatever, without having to say, these lights give me headaches because I am autistic.
I've actually talked about language like that with clients who are trying to form more boundaries with family, like instead of sometimes dropping diagnoses, which they just roll their eyes and they say, I don't even care, to say like, this affects me in this way, this tangible way, like giving me a headache.
Yeah, there's really, unless you are heading in that direction of making a claim that this is covered in the United States under the ADA, and I don't know what the equivalent laws are in other countries, but I would presume some similar. There's no code, there's no legal code that could list out every single potential request in every environment. So there's some loose guideline of what counts and what doesn't, no matter what. Unless you are intending to invoke that process, there is no reason to be discussing diagnoses at all. You don't need to say, I do this because it's a stim for me because I'm autistic and I get dysregulated, whatever. You can just say, doing this helps me to kind of stay focused and calm. When I'm getting overwhelmed, this helps me to get grounded. That kind of stuff. Now, for the most part, if you use that kind of language, especially again as a coach, if you're coaching your clients to be able to use that kind of language. Another example would be, instead of saying, I can't make eye contact with you because I'm autistic and eye contact is uncomfortable, which absolutely has the potential for them to then think of like, well, I don't want this person to be in a leadership role or a client-facing role or whatever. You can accomplish the same thing by saying, you know, sometimes when I'm looking people in the eye while they're talking, it's distracting, and I really want to make sure that I'm hearing and understanding what you're saying. So I'm going to be looking away from you, but I am listening.
It kind of reminds me of interviews where they say, what's your biggest weakness or whatever? And my canned response was always, I'm just a perfectionist. I just try to do so well that sometimes I push myself. But it kind of reminds me of that, like accommodating towards capitalism while telling someone what you need.
Well, and it's true, because again, needing to be able to invoke the research and the data, when you are overwhelmed, when you're dysregulated, you're not very productive.
Yeah.
When you're spending resources on masking or trying to hide what you're actually feeling or not doing what would actually benefit you, those are resources that aren't going toward what you could otherwise be doing.
Yeah.
Again, I am in a position where I'm focused on working on this from the other end of getting employers to make changes to how they're doing things, because it's just bad management. It's bad business. It's a very old-fashioned thing. We don't need to get into all of that. I mean, this isn't just me either, and it isn't just from people in the neurodiversity community. If you really look into like what executive coaches, not executive functioning, but executive coaches who work with CEOs and things, what they're talking about, everyone who's actually paying attention to this and what's happening and trying to be helpful is talking about the fact that that old way of working doesn't work so well. It creates resentment among your employees, high turnover. Essentially, if you as a manager think that your job is to get the most value out of an employee while giving the least compensation in return, right? Like, which is not how most of them would describe it, especially because the least compensation in return. But for the most part, a lot of managers would say, yes, my job is to make sure that I'm getting these employees to work as hard as possible. They might phrase it in different ways. I want to get everyone excited and incentivize good
Or work to their
performances
potential.
right. But a lot of the roles of especially middle management is essentially that the structure of a thing is that there is no incentive or support for employees to be doing the work that the organization wants them to be doing at the level or to the extent that they insert this other person that uses operant conditioning techniques, rewards and punishment, in order to try and get that. The thing that everyone's missing, partly because they're shying away from calling it what it actually is, which is you are trying to get more and better work out of them, generate more value for the organization without giving them more value in return, not giving them more money or better hours or anything, whatever. Is that when you approach that like it's a negotiation, then the other side is also going to act like it's a negotiation where their job is to get as much from you as they can while giving as little in return. They have, this is a commonly discussed thing. If you go to work and your boss says, here's what I need you to get done today, and you get it done in an hour instead of the 8 hours of the workday, and you go to your boss and say, here, the work is done and it's done at a high level, they don't say, well, great, take the rest of the day off. That's all that I had set for you to do for today, and you accomplished it. They say, awesome, I can start giving you 8 times as much stuff. This is great. And you become their highest performer, which then incentivizes them to keep you in the position that you're at. They don't want to promote you or ship you out to other places, which means they will compensate you, but only to the extent that you are making it clear that they must, or else you leave.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to give you raises out of the goodness of it. And again, different individuals operate in different ways and different order. It's not everybody, but yeah.
So what, I know this is like very general, but what would you say to a person like that who got 8 times the amount of work and is doing so well at their job and maybe not getting many raises, and perhaps they do want to get a promotion, but now you feel like they won't get a promotion because they've shown how productive they are in that position? What would you say to them?
Use your
like,
leverage.
Brandon, I want a promotion.
Use your leverage. In that situation, that means that you're working for someone who is not necessarily a bad person. Like, people just learn these ways of doing it, right? But that means that your supervisor is somebody who's viewing it as, wow, what a boon, what a bonus that you are doing so much more and so much better than I thought I was paying for when I hired you.
Yeah.
That means you have leverage. Meaning, if they were to replace you, they need to replace you with 8 people. There's a reason they thought that was a day's worth of work.
I would like an 800% raise, please.
Right. I can do that. But if you ask for a $10,000 raise, they'll give you 7. If you ask for 15, they'll give you 10.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a negotiation.
Yeah.
And most of the people that we're talking about that end up in this position, I would say, in my terminology, I would qualify as neurodivergent people. Most of the time, people who are trying to work all 8 hours and looking around at everybody else, including their bosses, and say, well, nobody else works as hard as I am. And, like, they keep working that hard. I swear the backbone of the American small business economy is that each small business of like 15 employees has one neurodivergent person that makes the whole thing work.
Mm-hmm.
It's like every university department has that one person whose title is like assistant to the whatever. That is the person that everybody knows. You go to them if you actually need anything done.
Yep.
Like all my friends. You're like, everybody asks me for help.
And back on theme,
but
what's going on?
I'm still paid $30,000 a year.
Is that they don't ask for what they want, like we've been talking about.
And they always ask, even if they ask for what they want, they ask for exactly what they want, as though it's not a negotiation.
Because
and that
they've
drives
already
me
done it in
crazy.
their head of saying like, okay, what I think would be a fair value is X, and then they ask for X, which is not how negotiation works.
And then they always get like maybe half of it or 75% of it.
Yeah, what is being calculated by the other end is, okay, if that's what you're asking for, you're probably willing to take less in order to avoid having to go find something else.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to figure out what's the number they can offer back to you. And even their first counter proposal is going to be the lowest one they would give. You ask for 10, they say, we can only do 6.
Yeah.
And then if you came back and say, well, I can do 9, then they might go up. But instead you're like, I have to send it in.
I just had a client do that, and it was so depressing because they got a raise, and then their what is it called, bi-monthly paycheck every 2 weeks or whatever. That paycheck has such a little impact on it, and they said, "Oh, I'm so excited." And I said in the session, like, "Well, how does that break down for every paycheck?" And then they got so excited, worked so hard to get the raise, and now every paycheck is about the same, and they're just like, it's so hard to watch people do that.
I want to be careful not to just take all our time and get off onto. I have a lot of thoughts about business practices. I run my business in a very different kind of a way.
It's the best place in the world. It really is.
And we're figuring it's trial and error, right? Because I can't really build it off of other people's models. So I'm trying to figure it out, and it's flawed, and it's difficult.
And it keeps getting better.
Well, that's the hope.
Yeah, it does.
I mean that.
So now do we go to I am the healer, but I can't heal myself, the wounded healer complex? I made you laugh! Yay!
That's good. I would like to go to that soon, but I want to wrap this one up. So first thing I would focus on is, especially in your role as a life coach, questioner, what can you support them in terms of what changes can be made, not only in the behavior that they're engaged in the work environment, and not only in the actual work environment itself, but a lot of what people don't pay attention to is what's happening outside of that context.
Yeah.
That no matter how, whatever particular brand of neurodivergent you are, that the symptomatic experiences that are problematic or unenjoyable or whatever increase as things generally are worse in your life and you're more tired and or more overwhelmed and whatever. And as you get other things, as everything kind of comes more in line, as people will often say, the clinical diagnostic criteria for autism is not what an autistic person does. It's what an autistic person does when they're experiencing severe distress. So well-supported and accommodated autistic people will often not display frequent meltdowns, for example, which is one of the diagnostic criteria, or severe struggles in social situations and interactions. So there are ways to try and work with it on that end. I would also work on communicating with your employer. Honestly, my first recommendation most of the time is to communicate with your employer within under the category of just asking for what you want before even working on making your own changes. And again, sometimes that's like, well, this is a policy. I can't ask to have an extra day at home. So sometimes you skip straight to that. But I would always start with just going to your boss and saying, this would really help me, or I would like this, or can I have this?
And it doesn't have to be like a 10-page document. Essentially, it's using the listings.
Honestly, again, even if it's one of those older fashioned style employers who are doing it as a negotiation, the more you ask, the more things you ask for, in their head they're thinking, I can't say no every time.
Yeah.
So if you ask for 10 things, you'll get a few of them. If you ask for 2 things, you'll get neither.
Yeah.
So just go.
And I think something to internalize is using relatable language as reasons for wanting the things. Yes. Because I think some people in our culture, at least in the United States, they hear things like autism and ADHD and they roll their eyes and they're just like, but if they heard like this will increase my productivity and decrease the likelihood of migraines, which will then increase my productivity even more, and I'll be the happiest employee ever, and I'll work 8 times as hard. And they're like, oh my gosh, sign me up.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I will re-emphasize. That's the second step.
That's the second step. Yeah.
Start by just saying what you like, saying what you want. I call that, like a lot of what we've been talking about lately, I call it preemptive justification.
Yeah.
Like, here's what I would like, but I anticipate pushback. And so if they were to push back, how would I explain why it's important or beneficial? And you have that ready to go. But just ask. They might not push back. They might say, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
No big deal. In which case, you would have just wasted all your time and energy that you spent coming up with a justification. Or you might, because you've already come up with it, put the justification out there without it being prompted, and that could take it off base into a different direction. By coming up with the justification, you're expending resources on the thing, which puts you in a mode that you're likely to think of it as more combative and be more afraid to go and ask for what you want.
Yeah.
look, if nothing else, if you are a neurodivergent person who is hesitant or afraid to ask for accommodations, I would bet that you already think this, and if you don't, look around at the people around you and you'll probably come to think it pretty quickly of why does everybody else just seem to get what they want and I don't? Everybody else, this person gets to leave early on this day to go pick up their kids, and that person gets to just like do online shopping for 2 hours every afternoon, and that because they're either asking for those things or they're just doing them without asking.
Mm.
If only there were some term we could use for people who are, for some reason, more inclined to be like, well, that's against the rules and I must follow the rules unless I get granted a specific, explicit exception to the rules.
Yeah. One of my previous work environments, that was totally true. And it was a medical system. And there were like all these requirements. And then it took me about 6 months to realize that the average person there was doing maybe 10% of it, like not even 50%.
Again, these places ask for way more than they expect because they expect employees to be doing much less than they're asked to do. That's part of the reason that they pay so low. If you ask them, they will give that justification. They will say, yes, that role is paid at such a low rate because these employees are slackers and they're unskilled and they're trying to get away with stuff all the time and I have to stay on them all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's genuinely how many of them think of it now. Again, anyway, just ask for what you want. If they say why, then go to step 2 of saying it in non-diagnostic terms. Also, as a life coach who works with neurodivergent people, I would suggest to you helping them to explore ways to talk about what they're experiencing and how things impact them without using clinically diagnostic language is a helpful thing in and of itself for the person. Because as I said over and over, there's nothing that you do because you have ADHD or you do because you are autistic. Those are labels we apply to a person because they experience those things.
Yeah.
They're labels which are accurate and useful. They are not the mechanisms that cause a thing. You're not distracted because you have ADHD. Because you're distracted, we say you have ADHD. If you weren't distracted, then we wouldn't say you have ADHD anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So be practical.
Try to get the client not to be, self-pathologizing? Is that a good phrase?
Right. And of course, I would talk about cost and value, right? What do each of these things cost them in the environment, in the work environment? What would the accommodations do in terms of lowering the cost and blah, blah, blah.
And to go quickly back to the family, I've had clients say something like, hey, could you do this next holiday gathering? And then without the clinical language and without the defensiveness and with like a plain language reason, sometimes they'll go to the next gathering and then the mom will be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we haven't done this. I feel so much better. Like these sort of sensitivities, all of a sudden the parents who are like, what's ADHD, what on? They're like, oh, maybe I've been doing that for like 30 years and just eating myself up. So it's interesting sometimes within families how it can be like a trickle down effect of positive.
Yeah, especially in families because there's a lot of overlap. And also just as a reminder to anybody who's watching this stream, if you're watching this stream, you are an online person who uses neurodiversity terminology online and likely operates in those circles. Other people do not think of these terms the way that you and we think about and talk about. There's a reason I define my terms.
Yeah.
We here in this stream, when we say autistic or think autistic, that's not what most people are going to think when they hear that term.
I would be curious, Marie and Brandon's opinion on a future stream about completely new language. I'm using completely new.
That would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
The wounded healer. Brandon, why are we so messed up? Even though we
Interesting interpretation of that question. So my first question for clarification to the person would be willing or able or both, right? They're saying, why am I so good at helping others but can't for myself? Are they talking about why is it so easy for me to put in the resources and the energy? Why am I so willing to help other people and not myself? Or are they talking about why can I come up with good solutions and ideas for other people? I'm able to come up with those solutions, or for myself, I can't solve these problems.
Yeah.
That's the interpretation I hear a lot. That's,
Okay.
yeah.
Well,
Especially from people with ADHD.
I will try and cover both to the best of my ability, but we'll start with that second one. And the easiest and best answer I have for that is something called fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error is the name of a cognitive bias. Depending on who you're hearing from, it can be described as kind of like the core cognitive bias. Cognitive biases are not the same, by the way, as like racial biases or cultural biases. Cognitive biases are just ways of describing patterns that we observe in how people use information. That you treat some information as more valuable than other information. And that's not a thing you can totally control. It's just you can't be aware of everything. So we're looking at patterns of, well, people seem to notice this kind of thing more than this kind of thing. It doesn't mean that they are a biased person. It just means in that selection process that you don't consciously control of what should I notice, what should I remember, what should I pull up from long-term memory that's relevant to this, what trends do we see there, right? So it's not a thing you're actively doing. I just want to make, I've realized recently, I think, that I didn't always understand or pay enough attention to the fact that when you use the term bias, people will often respond as though you're saying they're doing something bad. This is a universal thing that all humans.
And couldn't you say that some cognitive biases are actually advantageous too?
Well, they're all by definition advantageous, at least to the extent that they're necessary. You cannot be aware of everything. There have to be processes that select what things you notice and which things don't get noticed. And generally, the cognitive biases, there's people will debate on how to break them down and whatever, but generally they mostly fall under the category of we tend to operate as though the information we have is more important than the information we don't have. So the easier we have access to information, the more information we have, the more we treat that as like the important stuff, and then anything else that we don't know, it's probably not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's not. Anyway, fundamental attribution error. The like colloquial way to break it down is other people are simple, I am complicated.
Yeah.
Each person knows.
And that includes life coaches?
Each person knows orders of magnitude more information about themselves and their own experiences and memories and tendencies and likes and than they know about any other individual.
How dare you tell me to eat snacks in between meals?
So even in the case, what I would say is like the one where a person is going to know the most about somebody else is either a parent-child relationship or a spouse. What's the word I'm looking for? A monogamous, romantic, and co-life, partnering situation.
I mean, it could still be poly, but it could be your like primary too, right?
Well, but the more people involved, the less you know about any given individual person.
Yeah.
That's not to say that those relationships are diminished. I'm talking about resource expenditure.
Yeah, like the amount of exposure.
If you have 5 units of attention and you're distributing that to one person, you learn more about that one than you do if you're distributing it to 3, even if one of them is getting the majority of it.
Yeah, okay.
Which is important in this case because what we're talking about is you know more, you observe more, you think more about yourself and your own experience than anybody else, even your children, even your spouses, even whatever. It's impossible to put a number on it, just an unbelievably large amount. You are with yourself every moment of every day of your life. The people you spend the absolute most time with, you're still spending over the course of your entire life less than 1% of that time with them. So when you give somebody a simple problem, it's easy to come up with a solution. Think about like a test like the ACT, right? If I ask you a math question in that, there are certain things you can assume. Okay, one assumption, all the information I would need in order to be able to solve this problem has been given to me in the question. I don't need any other information except for how to like manipulate that information.
Mhm.
Same with when somebody else is telling you about a problem or asking for advice. Number one, they are selecting, not consciously, but through these processes, they're selecting what they noticed in the first place about their own problem. Of that, some small percentage of it do they remember. Of that, some small percentage of that is presented to you as though it is relevant to the problem. So someone will come and say, like, as an example, I am just so exhausted today because I can't get myself, I stayed up way too late last night. I can't get myself to go to sleep. That problem is now identified to you by them as, I need to get better at going to sleep earlier. They've set the parameters of the problem for you. Where the actual problem is, I'm exhausted today. And we don't know if it has anything to do with the fact that they didn't go to bed earlier than they did last night. There are so many confounding variables that they've already eliminated by not even presenting them to us.
Mhm.
So other people are simple.
Mm-hmm.
Problems are simple. It's easy to come up with solutions. Also, especially for neurodivergent people, designing a solution, coming up with an idea that would theoretically solve the problem, and executing the solution are two different things. And some people are very, very good at coming up with designing solutions, coming up, oh, you should do this, that would work. But that's a problem, or that's a solution I don't actually have to execute. I can just say, here's an idea that would theoretically work. And for yourself, you are likely coming up with theoretical solutions nonstop. Well, I could do this, I could do that. And then saying, yeah, but that won't work for me. I can't do that.
Mhm.
Because you have to think about the execution piece as well, not just what would theoretically work.
So does that kind of answer, Caitlin, what was your interpretation of the question? Because that was
The same
different. Okay.
lines. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess a follow-up for you, Brandon, would be if that person is a life coach, then theoretically they're pretty good at helping people with not only A, designing interventions, but B, executing those interventions that have been designed.
Life
And if
coaches
they're-
don't help with execution.
Really?
I should just say the asker of that question isn't a life coach.
I think that was the other person.
Oh, okay.
But
So is this just a
therapists too, we don't help execute. We're not there.
Yeah.
We can come up with ideas that we think would assist in execution, but that's just another solution.
Oh, okay. I was thinking you were saying just piece of advice, try this, without like piece of advice, try this. This might be able to do this, and this might be able
Which
to
is
do
just more pieces of advice to try to help you try the first one.
I want to be rebranded as an oracle. But that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, for the most part, like the only time that you're helping somebody else with the execution is when you're doing something for them or with them. When they're
Yeah.
saying, my house is a mess, and you clean it, then you've executed.
Yeah.
When they say, my house is a mess, and you talk through some idea with them, and then you do it with them, that's execution. But if they say, my house is a mess, and you say, oh, you should try this, or think about this organization, that's just ideas. That's design.
Yeah, sometimes I wish I could like teleport to the person's house and just like put on some music and help them clean up their room.
Well, not to keep hitting on the same theme over and over and over, but in many cases, those people actually have many people in their lives who would do that if they were to ask.
Interesting. I'm thinking about clients who are quite isolated. But that's a good point.
But clients who are quite isolated are likely isolated at least in part because they don't ask anybody for anything or tell anybody what they would like.
Whoa.
And if they were to call people up and say, hey, it'd be really fun to hang out.
That's true. I'm thinking of that client and they once called a friend to ask for help and it totally worked and it was great.
When you assume that everybody's going to either feel mad at you for asking or feel obligated to have to do it whether they want to or not, which would just lead to them being mad or resentful, you stop talking to people, you isolate. You are a therapist. You literally just said, sometimes I wish I could fly to the client's house and just clean it up for them.
Well,
help
with
them clean it
them.
up with
Help them.
Either way, not one of those clients I would bet good money ever thought, I bet if I asked that Caitlin would love to come help me clean this house.
Oh, that's true. So does that count as fundamental attribution error?
No.
Okay.
Well, I suppose you could make an argument, but
Okay. Yeah.
that would be like the fundamental attribution error could contribute. Just to cement that. Other people are simple, I am complicated. That's what everybody thinks. So, for example, that person cut me off in traffic. They're entitled, they think they're the most important person around, whatever. When I cut somebody else off in traffic, oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. Oh, shoot, my bad. Oh, I was just distracted. Or, oh, I hate this. I never, ever cut people off, but I'm in such a rush right now that I'm going to do it right now. Never when someone else cuts you off do you think, I bet they are so apologetic right now and feel terrible.
Sometimes I'll wave at people after I do something. I'm like,
an attempt to deal with this. My boss yelled at me because he's a jerk. I yelled at somebody because I am overwhelmed and they are not helping me right now, and they should have known better than to keep bugging me when I told them I needed some alone time.
So if this is a main cognitive bias, then how do we survive in communities?
I'm not sure I follow exactly. Why would that bias make it more difficult?
That sounds so like not cooperative and unempathetic.
Actually, it's theoretically very cooperative, because in a community, again, think on theme of all the stuff we've been talking about. If we're in a community, which member of our community should be in charge of you and knowing what you need and what you like and what you're feeling? And therefore, no one else has to worry about that if you communicate it to them.
I don't understand how that tracks. I feel like I'm.
If I was not paying as much attention to myself as, like, you're paying more attention to yourself, I'm paying more attention. Each of us is paying way more attention to ourselves.
Oh, I was thinking about the part that you were talking about where if someone cuts me off in traffic, they're mean. But if I cut someone off in traffic.
Well, an interesting thing about both the examples I gave is that there are instances in which the assumption is you either cannot communicate with the person or your ability to communicate with somebody. In fact, one of the major theories about road rage, the one that I find to be the most valid, it seems to me, is that we treat our cars as an extension of ourselves. That, like, if someone were to intrude on our personal space of our car, the distance that we need in order to feel comfortable, that it feels to us very similarly as when someone intrudes on our personal space bodies. But when it's us, when it's two people and someone does that, they can say, like, oh, sorry about that. Or excuse me, or think about how many things exist in our language which is just to smooth over those, like, times. Pardon me, you got to get through.
Absolutely.
But in the car, you can't do that. You can't say, oh, sorry, and we try, or whatever. But there's limits. And one of the interesting findings that I read, this was a long time ago, is that there's a correlation between the number of bumper stickers you have and how much road rage you experience. The more bumper stickers you have, the more angry you get as a trend.
You have one bumper sticker. You have two?
I don't know.
I have zero.
On. And the theory about why is because the more you have personalized your car, the more of you, and therefore the more upset it is when it becomes when someone intrudes. So anyway, again, communication is the key. Of course, first of all, it's unavoidable that I'm going to know more about me than other people. It doesn't mean I care more about me than I do about other people. It really depends on how you use that word, but I would argue that everyone cares more about themselves than everybody else, and that there's no other possibility, and that pretending like there is causes more problems, because then everybody sits around and thinks they're narcissistic.
Yeah, and a lot of our clients will think that.
Yeah, and that leads to people isolating themselves, which makes things worse for them and everybody they care about. What actually happens, or what actually helps in community, is I don't want to have to worry about you, Caitlin, you, Marie. I got my own stuff. I trust that you will tell me when there's something going on with you. Well, it doesn't have to be words, but words are the most precise form of communication. Not just spoken words, but modular language, shared language is the most precise form of communication. But if a person cries I know something's up.
Yeah.
If a person has a certain body language, I know something. Communication is the key. It's not about knowing everything for everybody
fundamental
else.
attribution error is at the core of the wounded healer complex.
Sure.
And thank you for coming to the business.
And I'll say there's an old proverb, and we'll wrap up because I have 2 o'clock. I'm gonna like work.
Yeah.
And I forget its origins, and I've heard different versions, so please forgive me. I'm sure I'm gonna mess this up from whoever originally, but I think it's from Eastern philosophy. But anyway, the idea of life is like a large banquet table that everyone is sitting at, and there's plenty of food for us all, but each of us are using utensils, chopsticks, or forks, or whatever that are 6 feet long. And so you see 2 versions of that in the proverb. One where everybody is starving, even though there's food all over the place, because no one can use the 6 foot long thing to get stuff to their own mouth. And then another one where everyone is happy and satisfied because everyone's using it and feeding each other across the table, and other people are feeding you. So the answer here is those people are coming to you because they didn't solve their own problem and they're looking for extra advice and ideas, and you're able to give them good suggestions. Now you are struggling to come up with your own ideas to solve your own problems. So what should you do? Go to other people.
Yep.
Just like those people did. The one thing that you're missing over and over, why are these people's problems getting solved better than mine? Because they're asking for help. It's not that they're asking you and you design all solutions. It's that they're asking someone that isn't them. They're getting different perspectives, different ideas. You do the same. So the real answer, yes, fundamental attribution error is a nice cognitive science and philosophy way to talk about. But the actual answer is because they're asking for help and you're not.
The same with the accommodations.
Yeah.
Right.
Why are you able to help other people with their problems and not yourself? Because everyone is able to help other people with their problems and not themselves. Yes, there are differences, especially in terms of willingness, but in terms of like the ability to come up with an idea, again, very much still differences. Different people are better at coming up with advice and opinions and whatever. But the major factor is they know that they have a limited ability to figure it out without getting advice, and so they're getting advice. You keep thinking you should be able to figure it out without getting advice. Except not totally, because you asked us this question. So thank you.
Thank you.
All of this is to make it a low ask, a low barrier to entry, low stakes way for people to ask for help, because that's, did I really say anything super substantive in answering that question? Talk about fundamental attribution error and asking other people for help. It's nothing specific. But if that person listens to this stream, there's a decent chance that going forward things are different for them.
Yeah.
Just because because to me you're simple. To me you're 2 sentences of a question. That's literally all I know about you.
Yeah.
And of course there's an infinite complexity, but talk to other people, communicate. Don't try and do it all on your own.
Mm-hmm.
This is those 2 things go in. Sometimes people act as though I am failing everyone if I don't give them 100% of everything I have.
Mm-hmm.
And why is everyone around me only giving 50%? And think that everybody should be giving 100% like they are because it's the right thing to do. But wait a second, isn't that working out terribly for you?
Yeah.
Aren't you like burned out and exhausted and isolated? There's a reason that not everybody is working as hard and giving as much as you are. And that doesn't mean that people who don't give you anything in return are doing the right thing or whatever. It just means ethical, moral, whatever, like it or not, when everybody's giving 80% and you're giving 100, you're just not going to get everybody up to giving 100%.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there's something to look at in asking for more or giving less. You got to balance it out. Don't try and do everything on your own. That's all. We're done. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you both. This has been fun. Thank you if you joined us, and if you watch when it goes back up on YouTube, leave us some comments. Feel free to send us more questions. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Blue Sky, Mastodon. We're everywhere now. So, and the website is effectiveartistry.com if you want to get in touch. It's been lovely to be with you. week.
Great to be with you. Thank you, Marie.
Hi,
Thank
Marie.
you. Thank you for the questions and everyone who's here.
Thank you.
Oh, I have to end. I'm sitting
You
here
get
waiting.
to
I was
end
waiting
it,
for Marie.
Brandon.
Marie does such a good job hosting. I was just waiting.
Oh, shucks.